First letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Aleph. We studied the letter Aleph in some detail. We saw that it points to the idea of godliness, of divinity. The Aleph comes right over here. I should have printed it on the page for us. We're going to proceed to the next letter in the alphabet, although we've covered a few other letters. Last week we looked at the Lamed, at the Vav, at the Zayin. We'll probably be hitting some of the letters of the alphabet during the 4 weeks, but not all of them. The Bet is the second letter of the alphabet. And in the code of first words, we learned this idea that you can learn about the meaning of a letter in the alphabet by finding the first time that letter appears at the beginning of a word. Now, you might think that the first time Bet appears in the Bible is in the word Bereshit, in the beginning, the very first word. But there, the Bet is really not at the beginning of the word. That's a prefix. The Bet there means in. So it really isn't part of the word per se. It's a prefix to the word. So the first time Bet appears as part of the word proper, as the first letter of the word proper, is in the word bara. So Bereshit bara, second word of the Bible. In the beginning, created. Right? In Hebrew, the verb and the noun are switched around. In English, we have God created. In Hebrew, literally created God. But that's Hebrew grammatical strangeness. So the second word of the Bible is bara, created. So the letter Bet has some connection to the idea of creation, to create. So the two first letters begin acting out a bit of a play. In the Talmud, they actually go through the entire alphabet, and they show how the letters, in the order in which they come, really give a presentation of very, very deep spiritual truths. So here we have the first letter, Aleph, God. What does God do in the very beginning? He creates. So the first letter, Aleph, God. The second letter, Bet, speaks about creation. That's what happens in our Bible, right? In the history of the world, in the history of the planet, God creates. Aleph, Bet. Maimonides taught that if we want to really understand anything about God, and he says specifically if we want to come to love God, we should study creation. We should study science. So the fact that God, Aleph, is followed by Bet, creation, is very significant. There's a tremendous connection, a tremendous relationship between the creation and the creator. If you want to understand an artist, you look at the art they produce. So if we want to understand God, what we try to understand is what are the works of art that God produces. We know that one of the things that God produced is the Bible. That's one of God's creations. That's one of his revelations. But another one, which is even more evident to us, is the world that we live in. And if we study human anatomy, if you study cell theory, if you study the complexity of the creation itself, Maimonides says we can come to understand a tremendous amount about the Creator. We understand about the Creator through his creation. Bet is the number 2. So again, Aleph is number 1. God is numero uno, right? We say God is one, which means many things. God is one meaning not more than one. God is one meaning perfectly single. God is one meaning primary, the most important. There are many, many ways of looking at this idea of Adonai Echad. God is one. It's not as simple as we often think. When I was in Israel in 1980, I found a book in Mea Shearim, which was very, very thick, a whole book just on that one verse in the Bible, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's not as simple as we often assume it to be. But the number 2 is Bet. That's our letter for tonight. And Bet is going to be connected to a number of concepts. Bet is connected to creation. We'll see why in a few moments. Bet is also connected to the idea of blessing, of bracha. Why is Bet connected to blessing, to bracha? So we have here the word barech, to bless. And we'll see that the letters in the word barech, Beit, Resh, Chaf, are the letters to, Resh is 200, Chaf is 20. So there's something about blessing and two-ness, that somehow two-ness is connected to the idea of blessing. So we have this letter Bet. Bet, we know now, speaks about creation. It speaks about the number 2. It speaks about blessing. Now, why is the number 2 an appropriate number for creation? So one of the things that we can observe very easily about the world is that the world is very dualistic. We live in a world that is very dualistic. We have light and darkness. We have masculine and feminine. We have good and evil, life and death, physical and spiritual. We have this world and the world to come. The nature of the world we live in is a dual world. We have this physical world and a spiritual existence after this world. We have a Torah, which is a two-part Torah. There's a written Torah and an oral Torah. We have the ideas of high and low, of hot and cold, of positive and negative, of yin and yang, if you will, in the Chinese systems. In the Kabbalistic way of thinking of the world, there are the two poles, for example, of chesed and gevura. Chesed is overflowing love and overflowing giving. Gevura is withholding, pulling back. And we have these polarities. There's giving, there's holding back. And we live in a world which is basically rife, full. It's defined by the fact that it's a dualistic kind of world. It's a world which seems to be split between different poles. And it's interesting that one of the major ideas that is addressed in the Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, is this polarity. The Shema has two different names of God. It has Adonai, Yud He Vav He, and it has Elohim. And the rabbis teach us that these two names of God reflect two different aspects of the way we perceive the way God interacts with the world. The rabbis teach that the Yud Ke Vav Ke, the Tetragrammaton, what we call Hashem, is the Midat HaChesed. It's God's overflowing love to the world. It's God being immanent. It's God being close to us. We speak about, for example, God our Father. So there is this relationship, this perception that we have of God being near to us, God being a parent, God being loving, God being close, God being immanent. But then the Bible speaks about Elohim. Elohim is called the Midat Hadin, the attribute of justice. That's not Avinu, our Father, that's Malkeinu, our King. That's not God as immanent, that's God as transcendent. And we experience the world in this way. We seem to experience God sometimes as very close to us and sometimes very distant, sometimes very merciful, sometimes seeming to be very cold maybe, and hard and harsh. And so the Shema tries to deal with this. What kind of world is it? The Zoroastrians basically said, you know what, it's a world where there seems to be good and evil. How do you explain good and evil in a world? They said there must be two gods, a God of light and a God of darkness, a God that's good and a God that's evil. So when the world is going nicely, the good God is winning. And when the world is going terribly, the bad God is winning. But that's a very compelling answer to the question of the duality of the world. It seems that the world has these two poles. So the Zoroastrians and other dualistic religions said there are two gods, two forces. The incredible statement of Shema Yisrael is to say, Shema Yisrael, listen everyone, listen up. There's Adonai, there's Eloheinu. It seems that God sometimes is distant, and God sometimes is close. God sometimes is merciful, God sometimes is strict. And it says, at the end of the day, it's Adonai Echad. It's one loving God. In God's essence, He's loving and giving and good and close. We don't always see that. It's hard for us to see it. But the Shema is telling us it's all one. It's not two different forces. So the number 2 is appropriate for creation because the world we're living in seems to be a world that is dualistic. The Maharal from Prague, the great Jewish mystic, says, what is the connection between the idea of duality and the idea of blessing and the idea of creation? How do these ideas tie together? The number two, blessing, creation. He says that blessing is only possible when opposites are able to come together in harmony. That's when you're able to have true blessing. For example, a human being has a physical side and a spiritual side, what we sometimes call our Yetzer HaTov, our good inclination, our inclination for spirituality, and our Yetzer Hara, our inclination for the physical, for the superficial, for the material. So how do we deal with this duality? How does Judaism approach the idea that we have two sides to us? So some religions try to resolve the tension by saying, look, what did Epicurus say? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow ye shall die. You know what? You're going to live in this world, have a good time, live it up, embrace your animal side. Just have a good time. And other religious philosophies said, you know what? If you want to really live a proper life, you've got to take a vow of poverty and a vow of chastity, and you have to give up all your possessions, and you have to sit in a lotus position on the top of a mountain and drink yak's milk and meditate all day long. There were these different approaches. Either you embrace the spiritual and reject the physical, or you embrace the physical, reject the spiritual. Judaism said no. We want somehow to have the physical operate in service of the spiritual. We want to somehow basically synthesize everything. And the Maharal from Prague is saying that the world is a world of thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, and synthesis. That's how things ultimately reach their highest level, where you have different streams, different poles, like we have chesed and gevura. We have this idea of giving and this idea of holding back. Well, the synthesis is tiferet. Tiferet is called the sphere of beauty because that's the resolution of these two opposites. That somehow it's beautiful, it's special, it's spiritual, it's wonderful when you're able to somehow work out how to properly navigate these two poles. Why does the Torah begin with a bet rather than an aleph? It's one of the topics that the rabbis discuss at great length. I mentioned, I think last week, I have an entire book written by a friend of mine from Miami, Florida, called Why Does the Torah Begin with a Bet? But one way of looking at the question is not why does it begin with a bet, why doesn't it begin with an aleph? Why does the Torah begin with the second letter of the alphabet and pass over the first letter? It's interesting that not only does the Torah begin with the letter bet, but if you study Talmud, you'll know that every book of the Talmud, there's no page 1. Every book of the Talmud begins on page 2. Why is that? Why does the Bible begin with the letter 2? Why does every page of the Talmud begin on page 2? So one approach to this is that the Torah ultimately has no beginning and no end. You shouldn't ever really think that you've ever finished it, right? So the fact that you don't really even get started on some level, you never get to the aleph. That's how ultimately infinite the Torah is. Also, aleph means, as we learned the first week, aleph means to teach, right? Ulpan is a place of instruction. So aleph means to teach. So aleph has the idea of teaching, and aluf, we saw that aluf means a master, a ruler, a king, the prince. So the Torah begins with a bet, because it wants us to remember that there is a teacher, there is a master that gave us the Torah, that is the teacher, that is the master teacher. But the master teacher can be found in the text, but is beyond the text. The aleph can be found in the text, but ultimately can't be captured entirely by the text. So the aleph is not there. We begin with the bet. The rabbis say that the aleph was very upset when it was passed over and God began the Torah with a bet. The aleph started to complain. Why'd you skip me? So God says, don't worry, when we have the 10 commandments that are given on Mount Sinai, you will be the first letter of the 10 commandments. The first word of the Aseret HaDibrot is Anochi, I am. the Lord your God, Anochi, begins with an Aleph, so the Aleph was appeased. But the rabbis teach us something that's very important. We have the creation story, the world, the physical world we're living in, that begins with a Bet, the secondary letter. But the Torah, the revelation of God at Mount Sinai, that begins with an Aleph. That's more primary, meaning if we're going to prioritize, what's more important, the physical or the spiritual? So the Torah, the teaching of the Torah begins with an Aleph. That's more important, that's more primary than the physical world we're living in, which really comes as a secondary idea to the spiritual. The word Bet in Hebrew, very close to the word Bayit. Beit is a house. Beit is a house, a bayit. And it provides protection. You have a little bit of a wall here and a wall back here and a roof over here, and you can go into the house. There's a little entrance over here. It provides protection, but the rabbis teach us our house should be open. The house should be open. The rabbis also teach that in our perspective, in terms of encountering the world, we should basically live in the present moment. Meaning, we should try to live in the present moment. We shouldn't try to think too much about what came before, what's below us, what's on top of us. Keep your eyes straight ahead. Be focused on the present moment. The letter Bet tries to teach us the importance of living in the present moment. The word Bayit, house, if you take the letter Beit itself, Beit you would spell out the same way you'd spell out the word Bayit. Beit and Bayit are spelled Beit Yud Tuf. Tuf is 400, Yud is 10, Beit is 2. So the letter Beit equals the number 412. And again, Beit is a Bayit, a house. But then we know there's something else in the Bible called a sanctuary, the temple. Right? God says in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, Ve'asu li mikdash, build for me a sanctuary, v'shochanti b'tocham, and I'll dwell among you. Meaning not that I'll dwell in that sanctuary. God says when you build a sanctuary, I'll dwell within you. On some level, each of us is a holy temple. Each human being is where God resides, in our heart. But we do have this structure called the Mishkan, or the Mikdash, the holy temple. The temple, a temple is spelled Mikdash, Mem is 40, Kuf is 100, Dalet is 4, Shin is 300, for a total of 444. So the rabbis teach what is the difference between a regular house and a temple. What is the difference? Well, 444 minus 412 is 32. 32 is the numerical value of lave, heart, meaning what can transform a regular bricks and mortar building, just a house, a simple house, into a holy temple, is when we put our heart into it properly. Interesting, by the way, the letter Bet is the second letter in the word lave, heart. Bet is the first letter of the 5 books of Moses, and Lamed is, as we saw last week, the very last letter of the 5 books of Moses. So the 5 books of Moses are totally encaptured, surrounded by Bet, Bereshit, Lamed in the word Yisrael, Lev. The 5 books of Moses is our way of learning how to direct our heart in the proper direction. The next letter in the alphabet is the letter Gimel. So we have the Bet, which is the house. We have the letter Gimel now. Gimel comes, it's related to the Hebrew word gamal. Gamal means to nourish something, nourish a plant or a vegetable or a fruit even until it becomes ripe. So gamal means to nourish something until it matures. And gamal also refers to the weaning of a baby. So gamal has this idea of nourishing and weaning and giving and supporting. Gamal also in Hebrew is the name of an animal called something that sounds like gamal, which is a camel. So camel is gamal. The rabbis teach us that the gimel this long part of the gimel is like the long neck of the camel. The word gomel, gimel is very closely related to the word gomel. Gomel means to give. Gomel is the Hebrew word of to give. There's an expression called gimilut chasadim. Gimilut chasadim means to give kindness or to do acts of kindness. The camel is described as an animal that has this quality. The camel is able to endure a tremendous amount of stress to help travelers survive the perils of the desert. The camel is able to store up a tremendous amount of water, and the rabbis teach us, just like a weaned child is able to go for a long time without drinking, the camel as well can go for a long time without drinking. But because of that, the camel is able to give to the travelers. The Hebrew letters Gimel or Gamal add up to 73. Gimel is 3, Mem is 40, Lamed is 30, 73. The Hebrew word Chesed, loving kindness, is 72. Chet is 8, Samech is 60, Dalet is 4. Now we mentioned previously, and we'll do more of this tonight, that in the rules of gematria, in the rules of Jewish numerology, you can add the value of 1 for the value of the word itself. So according to the teachings of gematria, Chesed could be read as 73. We'll see a little bit why later tonight. And therefore Chesed is considered to be equal in value to Gimel, giving, loving kindness. The words are very much related. You could read the word Chesed. Chesed can be read as Chas, to have compassion, Al, Dalid. Dalid is Dal, someone who is impoverished. So Chesed can have the meaning of to have compassion upon the one who is impoverished or poor. What Gimel represents, the letter Gimel represents the idea of giving, the idea of nurturing, the idea of sustaining, the idea of kindness. So Gimel represents God's overflowing kindness and chesed to the world. God is always in a position of giving to the world. According to the Kabbalists, the shape of the letter Gimel looks like a leader bringing down water from the roof of a building. Again, it's a flow, the divine flow from up on top and down towards the bottom. So if we look at the Hebrew alphabet, the first 3 letters, we see something very profound that's being taught. The first letter we have is Aleph. Aleph, the letter of divinity, of godliness. We saw that God, Bet, Bria, Borei, Bara, God creates. Why did God create? What was behind God's act of creating? So if you remember in the Bible, during the first 6 days of creation, after every single day of creation, the Bible says, Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. Some of the commentaries point out that it's not an accurate translation. What does it mean God saw that it was good? Meaning that God created something and then maybe it didn't turn out okay? Maybe God didn't have good quality control? Maybe he messed up? He's got to look at it and say, oh, that's pretty good. So some of the commentaries say that the word vayar in Hebrew doesn't mean that God saw, but vayar would be in the causative, meaning, and God caused it to be seen. God caused it to be seen, meaning God brought it into existence. Ki tov, because he is good. Meaning that when it says at the end of every day of creation, Vayar Elohim ki tov, it's not telling you that God evaluated his work as being good work. It's saying that God brought it into existence, ki tov, because he is good. So it says in the book of Psalms, Olam chesed yibaneh. The world is created out of an act of loving kindness. The God created the world as an act of compassion, as an act of giving. God, if you want to use the word desires, to give. And so you have Aleph, God, Bet, creation, through Gimel, through loving kindness, through giving. It's an act of giving. It's the motivation that led God to create the world. Not only does God create the world out of loving kindness, but the Torah itself begins with acts of loving kindness. God provides food for the human beings in the Garden of Eden. Not just any kind of food, pretty good food, pretty amazing food. And then we know that Adam and Eve eat from the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. The Torah tells us that they saw they were naked. And what does God do? He makes clothing for them. So the making of clothing, providing clothing to the poor, is considered an act of loving kindness. And throughout the Bible has God performing acts of loving kindness. God visits the sick when Abraham is sick after his circumcision. God comforts the mourners. God buries Moses at the very end of the Bible. As a matter of fact, the rabbis teach us that Chosmo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu is emes. That God's seal is truth, meaning the ending is truth. And burial is considered to be chesed shel emes. There are many kinds of loving kindness, many kinds of giving. But the rabbis teach that the most true form of giving is the giving we do on behalf of the dead. Because they can't pay us back. We can have no expectation that by doing kindness to the dead, we're going to get something in return from this person. Every other act of loving kindness, there could be some, in your mind, quid pro quo. That I'll scratch his back, he'll scratch my back. But burying the dead is considered to be chesed shel emes. So at the very end of the Bible, the rabbis say that the chosem, the seal of God, is truth, because the very last thing God does is to bury Moses. So God provided clothing for Adam and Eve after they sinned. But what's interesting is that what's the real clothing that God gives us? What's the ultimate clothing that God allows us to wear? It's not our physical clothing. The ultimate clothing, the ultimate garment that God gives us is spiritual clothing. Meaning that God gives human beings direction and instructions. And those instructions are called Torah. And Torah is the ultimate garment that we're able to wear. We're able to put on God's Torah. And so what happens is, in the Torah, when it says that Adam and Eve opened their eyes and they saw they were naked, it's like the emperor has no clothes. Not simply that they saw that they weren't wearing clothing. They were now naked of the one commandment they were given. They were given one instruction, and now they realize that they're naked, meaning they don't even have that one commandment they were given. But God provides both physical food and spiritual food at the very beginning of the Bible. The shape of the gimel is very interesting. It stands outside the house. Just like Abraham, who didn't just sit inside his house and wait for people maybe to come knocking at the door. The Bible tells us that on the day of his circumcision, when he was already in his 90s, an old man, and having gone through a very painful surgery of circumcision, the Bible says that Abraham went out into the heat of the day, into the hottest part of the day, sitting outside his tent to look, to make sure he wants to find, maybe someone's going to come by. He just can't, it's hard for him not to be giving. It's hard for him not to be helping people. So he's sick and he's old and he goes out into the hottest part of the day. He stands outside of his bayit, outside of his house, because he wants to give. He wants to be a gomel, just like God is a giver. God is a nurturer. God is a sustainer. Abraham wants to imitate God and do exactly what God does. The giver extends their foot. The giver is almost walking towards the daled. Daled we saw before means dal, the one that's impoverished, the one that's poor. So what happens is the giver doesn't just sit back and wait for the poor to come to them. The giver tries to actually reach out and extend himself toward the dal, towards the poor person. What is the code of first words for the letter Gimel? Anyone know what the first word in the Bible is that begins with the letter Gimel? So it's found in the story of the creation of the celestial spheres and bodies on the fourth day, where God created the great luminaries. And they're called Me'orot HaGedolim, the great luminaries. So the first time this letter, Gimel, appears at the beginning of a word in the Bible is in the word gedolim, great. Gedolim, great. Gadol means great. A person that's a gadol is considered a great person, a person that's grown a lot spiritually. What's the connection between gedolim, or gadol, to be great, to be big, and the idea of giving? So we see in the story of Moses, Moses grew up very much like the Buddha in the house of the palace of the king. But Moses, we're told, leaves the palace. And it says in the Torah that Moshe grew up. He grew up vayigdal. He became big. Moses became big. He became a big person. How? Torah says by going out to his brethren. The way we become big is by giving. The more we give, it's not that the less we have. The more we give, the more we have. We become much bigger and much bigger people by giving and giving and giving. So Moses goes out to his brethren to see how they're doing, to see their burdens. And we know that in the stories that follow, Moses comes to the aid of people. He breaks up fights. He saves people. But he's concerned. And he's giving not just a few dollars to people. He's risking his life. He gets involved. He extends himself. So by extending yourself, you're becoming bigger. And so that's the relationship between gadol, the code of first words here, and the idea of gomel, to give. Not only does giving make the person greater, giving also elevates the place in which the giving takes place. The rabbis tell an amazing story. There were two brothers. One was a bachelor, one was a family man. They owned together a very large field. They divided the field evenly. One day, the bachelor, the brother that's living by himself, says to himself, you know what? I don't need as much as my brother. My brother has to support a very large family. So I'm going to take some of my crop. And he decides in the middle of the night, when no one's watching, he sneaks into his brother's field and he leaves bundles of his produce in his brother's field. That same night, his brother had a very similar thought. He said to himself, you know, I have a bunch of children and they'll be able to take care of me when I'm an older person. My brother's all alone. You know what? Maybe I should help him. So this brother took some of his produce, bundled it up, and he brought it into his brother's field and left it there. In the morning, each one got up and saw, wait a second, I still have the same amount of produce. What happened? This went on night after night for many, many months. Until one night, in the middle of the night, these two people met as they were crossing the fields to each other's field. They saw that each one had a bundle of produce in their hands. Each one immediately realized what was taking place, what was going on. The rabbis teach us that at that moment the brothers dropped their bundles, they embraced, they cried, they kissed each other. And the rabbis teach us that on that spot, God chose to build ultimately the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That was the spot upon which the Holy Temple, the Beit HaMikdash, was ultimately built, because giving is something that elevates and makes holy the place in which the giving takes place. That's why the rabbis teach us something amazing. That when we had a temple in Jerusalem, the sacrifices were part of the way that we got close to God. The word sacrifice is korban, from the root karov, to become close. But the rabbis teach now that we don't have a temple and sacrifices, the same is accomplished through the guests that we host at our Shabbos table, or even during the week. When we bring people into our homes and we host them, we don't just give them food. The word company means kam pan, with bread, meaning that the food is just a vehicle to have a shared experience, that you want to have companionship, you want to be with people. So the rabbis teach that when we bring people into our homes, we host them at our table, that's what elevates us in the same way that the sacrifices in the temple used to elevate the Jewish people back then. And the Jews, the pious Jews of France, used to have an amazing custom. When people passed away and had to be buried, they would be buried in their Shabbos table. They would take their table on which they hosted people for so many years, and that table became the wood that was used to build their coffin. Now we saw over here that Gematria has this rule of the kollel, that you can take the value of the word and add it to the number of the word itself. Is there a source for this in the Bible? Meaning, is there a place where the Bible teaches you that you should actually do that? So when Jacob was blessing his children, we know that Jacob blessed all his children, but his son Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And what Jacob did was to say that his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, will be considered like children to him. So Jacob says, Ephraim u'Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh, Keruven v'Shimon yihiyu li. This is in Genesis 48:5. Jacob is saying that Ephraim and Manasseh, my grandchildren, will be just like Reuven and Shimon, my oldest two boys. The rabbis teach something amazing. If you take the two names, Ephraim and Manasseh, anyone have a calculator here? You may want to check up on me. Aleph is 1, Pei is 80, Resh 200, Yud is 10, Mem is 40. Mem is 40, Nun 50, Shin 300, Hey is 5, for a grand total of 682. Reuven and Shimon, Resh is 200, Aleph is 1, Vav is 6, Bet is 2, Nun is 50, Shin 300, Mem 40, Ayin 70, Vav 6, Nun 50, for a grand total of 683. 682, 683. They're one apart. But what does the Torah say? The Torah says Ephraim and Manasseh will be considered equivalent to Reuven and Shimon. So the rabbis teach that this is one of the sources that teach us that a gematria can be one off. Because here you have these two expressions are one off, and yet the Torah says they're considered to be equal. The Bible teaches us that the affliction, the spiritual affliction called sara'as, sometimes it's translated as leprosy. It wasn't really the kind of leprosy that we have as a physical disease, but in the Bible, there was a spiritual malady called sara'as, and the rabbis teach that this was something that attacked people who went about talebearing and slandering others. So the Bible says, Lo telech rachil be'amecha, Lo telech rachil ba'amecha, don't go about as a talebearer among your people. If you take the numerical value of this phrase, it's equal to the numerical value of nega sora'at, the plague of sora'at. So when the rabbis taught that sora'at came about as a result of slander, we find that the numerical value of both of these phrases is equal to 883 exactly. We don't need to fudge one. Both of these phrases come out to 883. In the Passover Haggadah, we know that there are 4 children that are discussed at the very beginning of the evening. There's the wise son, and then there's the son that's called the Rasha, the wicked son. And the Haggadah has what seems to be a pretty strange directive given to the leader of the household in how to deal with the wicked child. The Haggadah says, Hake et shinov. Hake literally means to hit. Hake et shinov, hit him in the teeth. Sometimes translations of the Haggadah say, blunt his teeth, whatever that means. It seems like what it's saying is, just give him a sock in the mouth. It doesn't seem to be good pedagogy. It doesn't seem to be the kind of action that's going to really help that much. But the rabbis notice something interesting. The word Rasha for an evil person, the numbers Rasha add up to 312. 200 for 500, and ayin 70. Rasha is 570. Hake et shinav, hit him in the teeth. But shinav is teeth, but shin is a letter in the alphabet. So they say you should take this rasha and knock out his shinav, knock out his shin. Not his teeth, knock out his shin. So you take the word shinav. Shin is 300, nun is 50, yud is 10 and 6, for a total of 366. If you subtract 366 from 570, you're left with how much? A grand total of 204. 204 is the numerical value of tzaddik, a righteous person. So kuf is 100, tzadi is 90, yud is 10 for 200, and dalet is 4, 204. So the Gemara says, if the child is wicked, knock out his shin, meaning transform him into a righteous child. Don't beat him up. You've got to do something that's going to transform them. One of the scariest chapters in the Bible is, we read last week in the synagogue from Parshat Bechukotai, called the Tochacha. It's the admonition, it's the long series of maledictions that God promises we will receive if we totally abandon God. In the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, we have another set of Tochacha, another list of maledictions, of curses that God sends our way if we don't listen to his voice. V'haya, it will be. Im lo tishma b'kol Hashem, if you don't listen to the voice of God. On this phrase, if you don't listen to the voice of God, the Midrash, the rabbinic Midrash, quotes a verse from the book of Psalms. It says in the book of Psalms, Rabot, Ra'ot, Tzaddik, the righteous one has many terrible things that happen. Rabot, many, Ra'ot, terrible things, Tzaddik, happen to the righteous one. Umikulam yatzilenu Hashem. But from all of them, God saves him. So many things that are difficult might happen to the righteous person, but God saves that person from all of them. Something incredible was discovered. The word ra'ot here, evil, terrible things, adds up to 400 plus 200, which is 600 plus 70 and 6. 676. The numerical value of the word ra'ot. If you count the number of words in that portion of the Bible, the Tochacha, all of those curses, it has 676 words. What's amazing is the name of God appears 26 times in that chapter. The name of God again is the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Tetragrammaton, Yud Hey Vav Hey, 10, 5, 6, 5, for a total of 26. So God's name of 26 appears 26 times. 26 squared is 676. So we see in this horrible chapter of curses, and what's amazing is the rabbis teach that whenever you have this word, v'haya, it's a word of simcha, a word of joy. So even though the chapter promises that horrible things can happen to us, the truth is, if we learn to read it properly, all of these curses can be transformed into blessings. And that's why the Midrash says on this passage that many evil things, 676, might befall the righteous person, but all of them, he'll be saved from who? From Hashem. Hashem, whose name appears 676 times in this passage, is able to cancel out the 676 words in this passage of maledictions. The bottom of the page, we have the word Sukkah. The Feast of Tabernacles in the Bible, commemorating our sojourn in the desert when we dwelt in booths, in huts. Every year we build huts after Yom Kippur. We live in them for a week. The rabbis pointed out something very interesting. If you look at the shape of the letters in the word sukkah, it illustrates the laws of how to build a sukkah. Ideally, a sukkah should have 4 walls. One of them could be a door. If it doesn't have 4 walls, it could be okay if it has 3 walls. You can build a kosher sukkah with 3 walls. And as a matter of fact, even if it's not 3 full walls, but 2 full walls and a fraction of a wall, that's also, at the very least, a kosher sukkah. So the shape of the letters in the word sukkah tell you how you can build a kosher sukkah. In the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 2, this is the first of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. We read it before, we learned it before. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out of the land of Egypt. The word Asher, that, is Shin Resh, 300, 200, Aleph is 1, for a grand total of 501. 501. If you remember from the Passover Seder, the rabbis gave the 10 plagues a mnemonic. If you can't remember all 10 plagues, so they said if you remember these 3, Tetzach, Dam Tzfardei Kinim, Adash, Arov Dever Shchin, Ba'achav, Barad Arbe Choshech Bechorot. These are the 10 plagues. If you add up the letters here, the numerical value of these letters, they add up to 501. And therefore, there were people who read this verse as follows. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Asher, it was these 10 plagues that ultimately Hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim took us out of the land of Egypt. That God took us out through the agency of these 10 plagues. The same numerical value, 501, 501. We had the word last week, if you recall, Torah. Torah is tough for 400, Vav 6, Resh 200, Hey is 5, for a total of 611. I mentioned earlier that there's a 2-part Torah that God gave us. There's a written Torah and an oral Torah. The word written is bikatav. Torah, bikatav, Torah in writing. Beis is 2, Chaf is 20, Taf is 400, Beis is 2, for a grand total of 424. Then there's the oral Torah. It's called Torah Ba'al Peh, Torah that is oral. Ba'al Peh is 30 and 70 for 102, 102. Pei and Hey is 85. 85 and 102 is equal to how much? 187? Yes? I'm going to trust you. And if you add 187 to 424, what do you get? 611. So the numerical value of written and oral is 611, which is the word for Torah. When I was in Israel back in 1980, I met with one of the greatest rabbis of the generation. He was called the Stipler Gaon. He lived in Bnei Brak. And I purchased his entire library from him. Most of the books went to my school, but I kept 3 for myself. One of the books is called Birchat Peretz. And he does something that's quite astounding in this book. He did it without the use of an adding machine or without the use of computers. He did it in his head. I showed you one of his calculations last week when it says in the Bible that the whole world was Safa Echat, one language. And Rashi says, what was that one language? Rashi says, Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. The Stipler Gaon pointed out that the numerical value of Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue, was the same numerical value as Safa Echat, one tongue. So what he does in this book, incredibly, is he shows that if you read Rashi's commentary to the Bible, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of places where he finds that if you take Rashi's commentary and you take its numerical value, it's exactly the same as the numerical value of the words he's commenting on. Another example, when the brothers and Jacob come down to Egypt, we're told that Joseph gives them a possession, a place to live in Egypt. He gives them Achuzah be'eretz Mitzrayim, a place in the land of Egypt, and we're told it was b'meitav ha'aretz, in one of the best places of the land, from the word tov. He gave them a tract of land b'meitav ha'aretz, where? Be'eretz Ramses, in the land of Ramses. On this passage, Rashi says that the land of Ramses was in the land of Goshen. The Torah here doesn't say it was in the land of Goshen. Rashi tells you it was in the land of Goshen. The Stipler Gaon pointed out that the numerical value of B'meitav ha'aretz, in the best part of the land, is equal exactly to the word Goshen, 359. The numerical value of this also, 359. And he shows in this book, Birchat Peretz, countless examples of the Torah, Rashi's commentary. They're equal numerically. The word staka, very familiar to us, is the word often translated, really mistranslated, as charity. It's not really charity. Charity is from the Latin caritas, based upon your feelings, like charisma. Staka is not based upon feeling sorry for people. It's from tzedek, which means righteousness, justice. We are obligated to give tzedakah. And the rabbis teach how we can give tzedakah, what are the parameters. So we're told that if you have 100, kuf is the letter for 100, you can make the 100 into tzadi, 90, and give 10%. That's the minimal amount that you're supposed to give. We're supposed to give 10% of our income to tzedakah. We can make 100 into 90. Or, if you want to be very generous, you can make 5 into 4 by giving 20%. That's the maximum you could give. You're not supposed to give more than 20%. The rabbis didn't want you to become poor yourself. So if you want to give the minimal amount, 10%, the maximum, 20%. And if you add up the letters here, it's 90 and 4 and 105 for a total of 199. Why is that? Because that was the amount of money that you were able to have and still receive payah. Payah was the biblical requirement for people to take the corner of their field and set it aside for the poor. So how poor did you have to be in order to be able to collect payah? If you had 100 zuz, if you had 200 zuz, you couldn't collect payah. But if you had less than 200, meaning from 199 down, then you could receive charity or tzedakah. So tzedakah adds up to 199 because that's the number that's the upper number you can have before you receive tzedakah. The Torah says in Numbers 25:11 that when Pinchas shishkebabbed that couple that were fornicating in public, we know there was a horrible scene in the Bible where a couple is having a sexual act right in front of Moses' tent, and God is very upset. A plague breaks out. Pinchas, in an act of zealotry, takes a spear and basically rams it through this couple in the middle of their act. The Bible says that by doing this, he was able to turn et chamati. Heishiv et chamati. He was able to turn around my wrath. That in doing this, Pinchas was able to stop the plague and turn around my wrath. In the Bible, in the Midrash, the rabbis say that this is explained by a verse in Psalms, I believe Psalm chapter 106, I may be wrong, which says that the act that Pinchas did was an act of tzedakah. That the act of Pinchas was an act of tzedakah. How was it an act of tzedakah? So in the Bible, one of the major collections that was taken was called the Machatzit HaShekel, the half shekel collection. Every Jew had to give 3 half shekels to the temple sanctuary. The word machatzit is an interesting word. The middle letter is tzadi. We can say that tzadi represents tzedakah. If you look at the 2 letters that surround the tzadi, you have chet and yud, which is chai. Chai is life, living, life. The 2 words that are far away from the tzadi are mem and taf, mate, death. Tzadi, tzedakah, has the ability to push aside death and to bring close to life. That's what the rabbis teach. That giving charity has the ability to push death away and bring close to life. There's an expression, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, that tzedakah has the ability to save us from death. So when it says that Pinchas's act was an act of tzedakah, he was able to push away met, the death, and bring closer to life. That's what it means in Numbers, where it says that he was able to return around, to push around at chamati. The word chamati has, again, mate in the middle. Mate here is in the middle, mem and taf. And chai is on the outside. So by his act of charity, Pinchas was able to turn around the word chamati and bring the chai closer to the middle. This word is an unusual word. God willing, you should never have to know from it. It's the word get. What is a get? Get is the bill of divorce that ends a marriage. A Jewish marriage has to have a ketubah, a marriage document that basically formalizes the marriage. But if a marriage unfortunately has to come to an end, the rabbis teach us that when a marriage ends, even the altar of God sheds tears. But when that marriage ends, it has to be concluded with a bill that's given to the woman called a get. The question is, why is it called a get? Why is it called a get? So there are several reasons that are given. One reason is that Gimel and Tuf are 3 and 9 for 12. The get is written in 12 lines. It has 12 lines of writing. But the more significant reason, and this was pointed out by the Vilna Gaon, and you can imagine the Vilna Gaon didn't have a digital Bible to figure this out. But he was able to know that in the entire Bible, the letters Gimel and Tet never appear side by side. In the entire Bible, you will not find one word where the letters Gimel and Tet appear near each other. More than that, not even at the beginning and end of a word, you won't find one word beginning with a Gimel and another word ending with a Tet. They won't even appear next to each other at the beginning and end of words. So just like these two letters symbolize a total separation, that's what happens with the get document. There's now a total separation between this man and woman. In Exodus 19, the Torah tells us that when God was going to reveal the Torah at Mount Sinai, he told the Jewish people, Hagbel et hahar, make a boundary from the word gvul. Gvul is a border. Hagbel et hahar, make a border, a boundary around the mountain, the kidashto, and make it holy. We know that people were not supposed to approach Mount Sinai during the revelation. So God tells them, set up a boundary, a border. Hagbel et hahar. Make a boundary surrounding the mountain, and then make it holy. The holy Belzer Rebbe saw something incredible. He said, take this word har, mountain. Here we have it over here. And surround it. Take the word har and find the surrounding letters. Right before a hey comes the letter dalet. Right after the hey comes the letter vav. Take the letter resh. Right before resh comes kuf. Right after the resh comes a shin. This is the letters of kadosh, holiness. So the verse says, surround the mountain and make it holy. When you take the word mountain, har, you surround these letters from the letters before and behind each letter. It spells out holiness. Numbers chapter 20, the Jewish people are very thirsty. There's no water. God tells Moses to approach. There's a rock. He says to Moses, take your staff and speak to the rock. Take your staff and speak to the rock, and it will give forth its waters. In the story, Moses does not speak to the rock. Instead, he takes his staff and he strikes the rock twice, and the waters come out. Vayach et hasela, he smote the rock, b'matehu, with his staff, pa'amayim, twice, vayetzu mayim, and the water came out. He struck the rock twice with his staff, the water came out. We take the word selah, samech lamed ayin. Selah is a rock. And if you spell the letters out, you don't just take samech, but you spell out samech. Samech, mem, chaf is the letter samech. Lamed is lamed, mem, daled, the letter lamed. Ayin, ayin, yud, nun. What did he do? He took this rock and he hit twice. He hit the first letters, knocked them away. He hit the last letters, he knocked them away. And by hitting this rock twice, you were left with mem, mem, yud, mayim, water. So in the verse, when it says that he hit the rock twice and water was revealed, water came out, that's what happens when you spell out the word selah and you hit twice, you knock off the beginning and the end letters, and in the middle comes out mayim, water. We know that in the Bible, there's the law of lex talionis, Exodus 21:24, which people assume means literally an eye for an eye. If you poke out someone's eye, the law says that your eye is poked out. If you chop off someone's arm, your arm is chopped off. That was never the Jewish law. Jewish law says that if you hurt someone physically, the punishment is you pay 5 different monetary fines. You pay for the loss of their limb, for their pain, for their embarrassment, for the loss of wages. There are 5 different things that you are assessed. But you don't actually take out the person's eye. The Vilna Gaon found an amazing clue, amazing hint for this. It says in the Bible, ayin, tachat, ayin. You could read it, an eye in place of an eye, meaning instead of an eye, you give an eye. Or the word tachat, you know, means underneath. That's why the Yiddish word tuchis means what it means. It's what's underneath us. So tachat means that which is underneath. So the Vilna Gaon said, ayin, if someone takes out an eye, the penalty is that which is tachat ayin, what is underneath ayin. Underneath the ayin is a pei, under the yud is a chaf, under the nun is a samech. It spells out kesef, money. So the penalty for taking out someone's eye is not the eye, it's payment of money. One final example for tonight. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, the Torah tells us, Aser ta'aser et kol tfuat zarecha, you should give surely 1/10 of all the produce of your fields. This is the commandment to give basically 1/10. Aser ta'aser, you should certainly give 1/10. On this verse in Deuteronomy, there's something called the Midrash Pliya. Pliya is the Hebrew word for totally astonishing and strange and incomprehensible. So there's a collection of rabbinic midrashim. It's not the normal midrashim like Midrash Rabba, but Midrash Pliya is a collection of very weird, strange midrashim. On this verse, which teaches us to take 1/10 of our produce, the Midrash quotes a verse from Genesis chapter 13, where Abraham was parting ways with his nephew Lot. And he says to his nephew Lot, Im hasmol ve'emina. If you go to the left, then I will go to the right. Ve'im heimin, then asmi ella, then I will go to the left. What in the world are the rabbis quoting this passage for? What does this passage of Abraham parting from his nephew Lot have to do with the charge that we have to give 10% of our income to charity? What is the relationship? So the rabbis teach a very famous teaching. It doesn't just say give 1/10. It expresses it by saying aser ta'aser, almost emphasizing the idea of 1/10. So the rabbis teach aser, give 1/10, kedei shatit asher, so that you should become wealthy. The rabbis teach that one of the most amazing skulot, one of the most amazing things that can bring us wealth is by giving away our money. If you give charity, we're told, we're promised we'll become wealthy. Listen carefully to the word here. Aser, this letter shin, can be pronounced in one of 2 ways. If there's a dot on this side, it's asher. If the dot appears here, it's an S, eser. So the rabbis say, aser, give a tenth, kedei shetit asher, that you will become wealthy. The word ashirut is wealth. Eser is 10. So the rabbis say on this verse, if you will go to the right, I will. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. What do they mean? They say this, the following. That if you put the dot on the left-hand side of this word here, if you go to the left, eser, you give a tenth, then tit asher, then I'm going to go to the right, and it's become ashirut, wealth. If you go to the right, if you go to the left, I'm going to go to the right. If you give a tenth, I will make you wealthy. But if you go to the right, if you want to remain wealthy by not giving charity, so you put the dot on the right, asher, ashirut, you want to maintain your wealth, that's what you're interested in, you go to the right, then God says, then I'm going to go to the left. Then you won't become wealthy. Then you won't even achieve 1/10. You won't achieve 1/10 of what your fields are capable of producing. So the rabbis explain this midrash pliya in an incredible way. I'm going to end with one final gematria for tonight. There's a verse in Deuteronomy which says, "Kilo davar reik hu mikem." Kilo davar reik hu mikem. For this is not a vain thing unto you. For this is not a vain thing unto you. The rabbis read this, and if you do find it to be vain, it's mikem, it's because of you. Meaning the fault is not with this thing, it's with you. So what is it talking about? Lo davar reik hu mikem. It's not a vain thing from you. The gematria, the numerical value of that phrase, is equal exactly to the word gematriot, which is the word for numerical value. So it's easy sometimes to not take gematria seriously. The Talmud says it's one of the things that's a handmaid into wisdom, parparot l'chachma. It's considered to be one of the ways in which the Torah can be interpreted. Even though there's a danger that you can play around with this and invent things that are not necessarily legitimate, Nachmanides pointed out that people can misuse gematria, but he says that if it's done responsibly, like most things in this life, it can be an extremely valuable tool for unearthing incredible secrets and symmetries in the Bible.